Welcome. This is Girls Who Gap with Habs and Muffy. And even as Muffy has a little bout of regaining her voice with laryngitis, we are discussing how to chart a career for yourself, of course. Stay tuned. Hi, Habs. It's Muffy. And hello to all of our listeners. I have had a bout of laryngitis. Last week, I actually couldn't even talk for 3 days. Like I could only whisper. So this voice, as crackly as it may sound, is actually coming back from that. And I feel it's strong enough to take on this topic of how to chart a career, or how did I chart a career? That's, I think, a really interesting topic, especially Habs, given you've got T, who's going to be starting her college career soon and starting to chart her own career path, which kind of all starts right when we go off to college or our first job post-high school. Whatever that is, that's kind of our foray into charting the work we're going to do as an adult in our lifetime. I don't know when I was going into college if I actually thought about it that way. I think I was just like, okay, I'm expected to go to college. This is my next part of school. I think I didn't recognize that I was like charting my career. But actually, as I look back on it now, it was the start of that. I ended up choosing to be an English major and a political science minor. I thought, well, I love to write. I love to read. Those sorts of skills will take me to whatever I want to do in life, whether that be graduate school or doing some sort of writing. It didn't really matter. I just felt like with a liberal arts degree, having that type of foundation, I could pretty much do any number of things. And of course, as I went along in school, I felt like I had to go to like law school. So I was like, okay, well, English and poli-sci is a great combination to do pre-law, and go into law school. When I got out of college, I graduated with some student loan debt. I mean, back then, we were in college, Habs, between 1989 and 1993. If you were taking student loans out at that time, they were really very much government-backed, low interest rate loan. They were not privatized. They were not high interest. Colleges, even small liberal arts ones were, I thought they were expensive at the time. Now I look at them and think they were dirt cheap. But like you could cut a school and yeah, you owed some money, but it wasn't like do or die money that you were going to pay off for the rest of your life. So I felt very grateful for that. But I did come out, I'll have to say I had I think about it, like $12,000 of debt. For a 22-year-old coming into the world, that's a lot of money. So I was like, well, I better pay this off. What am I going to do? How am I going to get a job? I moved to DC thinking I'm going to work on the Hill and do something like with Congress. And I did become an aide for Congressman Bonnier's office first out, but it was an unpaid internship. And I don't come from a wealthy family where, my parents could just write a check for my expenses and I could just do something like that. I loved it, but it was short-lived. I was like, well, if I want to do if I want to go to law school, I better go work in a law firm and get paid, also see about this career path. So that's what I ended up doing. I ended up going to work at a law firm for several years. And, I just was not for me. I'll just say that. It wasn't just the work itself, but the lawyers who were at this firm, they just seemed really, really unhappy. And they were really laden down with debt. If I had $12,000 of debt coming out of undergraduate, these people had $50,000 or $60,000 of debt at that time coming out of law school. And I thought, oh my God, how would I ever pay that off? I'd have to pay it off by being a lawyer. And if I'm not happy doing it, then I'll just be unhappy. So that kind of really, the idea of what it would cost to go to law school, to end up doing something that didn't seem that interesting to me, for whatever reason, it just didn't, really turned me off. And I remember calling my parents and saying, look, I'm not going to pursue law school. And they basically lost it on me. Like, you have to do this. I'm like, I don't really think they understood like what being a lawyer is or what that work would entail. It just sounds good that our daughter's a lawyer somewhere in the world and go do that. And like, I just had to stand up to them and be like, no, I don't know what I'm going to do. But once I made that decision that I wasn't going to go to law school, I was like, I don't need to stay at this law firm anymore because I had stayed there probably far too long for what it was. And then I ended up, well, I was like, what is this work and development? What is development work? Which is basically fundraising. I ended up fundraising for several organizations in DC. And they were anything from like writing grant applications to get grants from like corporations or foundations to doing events to cultivate donors and that, donor base. I started doing that type of work. And I did it for a major institution in DC. And that wasn't that inspiring to me. And then I ended up going to a national nonprofit. That was very interesting. And I did that work for several years. And I mean, people make full careers out of development work and grant writing. But at some point I was like setting off all these applications. I was like, wait a second. What happens on the other side when people get my application? Like, how do people make a decision about whether my project's worthy to fund or not versus other people? I got really curious about that. And so that led me to my next stop, which was to become a grant maker. And I did that with a foundation in DC that served teachers. And that was just fascinating coming from the other side of the table of having been a grant, requester, like a grant seeker, to like becoming the one to like give out grants in the philanthropic world. I would say that that was definitely a highlight of my career path. But again, it wasn't something like I went to college and said, I'm going to write grants. I'm going to become a grant maker. And I'm going to go into philanthropy. This all just sort of evolved as I kind of rolled along in my career and thought, oh, this isn't working, or what's next, or this sounds more interesting. It was very organic evolution, I guess, which there's not a lot of tolerance for that anymore these days. People want everything known and laid out. I'm doing this if I go to that. And like my life has never really unfolded that way, particularly professionally. And I think that's okay, actually. I think it led to a more interesting life, actually, how I charted it and how I lived it. So anyway, alongside doing all this philanthropy work and, grant seeking and grant making, I ended up launching a little kids party planning company. I mean, I just liked parties. I enjoyed children. I had been a nanny when I was in college. I thought it'd be fun. It just seemed like there were a lot of extravagant birthday parties parents were having for kids in the DC area, but nobody really there to help, like plan the party that was exclusive to kids. So I just, this is back in the day before the internet and computers and all this. I just wrote up a little flyer and I just, I'm a kids party planner and here's my phone number. And, if you need help with your kids' parties, call. It was really simple. And I just went around coffee shops in the Bethesda, Chevy Chase area and put it up. And it was funny. It was so kind of grassroots. And then one day, like weeks later, somebody called my phone number and we didn't have cell phones back then. So it was just your phone number at home. And I picked it up and they're like, hey, are you a kids party planner? I picked up your little tag here off of your poster. And I'm like, well, indeed I am. And that's how I became a kids party planner. And I loved that I ran that as a side business during my day job that, took up my weekends and some evenings, but most kids parties were on the weekends. And, it's kind of word of mouth business. And there weren't many people doing just kids parties. So I started getting a lot of word of mouth business, which is great. So I was running that alongside my career, my day job career. And it was fun. And then I came to a place where I was like, okay, I'm ready to leave DC. I want to do something else. Or it was, leave DC or do my kids party planning full time. I was not interested in staying at the grant making place anymore. I had sort of run that to its fruition for myself. I felt like I need to move on. And I had enough of a client base. I mean, I think that was about 3 years in that I could do that work full time But instead, I gave up all my careers and went to India for a very personal, time with myself to reconcile my biracial identity, actually. So I just like gave all that up. And I was like, well, if my kids' party planning business is meant to be, it'll come back at some point in the future. And in fact, it did. After I had that big journey with my identity, I married and I lived abroad for several years, doing funny little jobs in these different countries, meaning Canada and Australia. I ended up moving to Seattle and living there for 17 years. And I relaunched my kids' party planning business with a partner online as a tech-based business. And I pursued that for 5 years. Unfortunately, that company did not work. It did not succeed in the end. It just didn't have enough cash flow really for what it was, although I gave my heart and soul to it. So that shut down. And then I was like, okay, what am I going to do? Then I went back, of course, to my writing, creative writing, because that's always home base for me. Always was from college on. Oh, I started doing screenwriting, learning the art of screenwriting and enjoying meeting fellow screenwriters and pitching screenplays. And, I didn't get very far, of course, because I live in Hollywood and I'm a little bit older. And not to say you can't get into it when you're older, but, it just didn't work out. And I think I would have continued to pursue it, but I was just like, I can't just sit here every day and just write these screenplays with no assurance that I will get paid. I mean, it just felt like a lot of labor for no assurance that you get paid. I was like, oh. I mean, I think a lot of people who I knew who like they had children and they had, basically having kids, Habs, is having like a full-time job. And then they would write when the kids were in school or this and that, they're trying to sell a screenplay. Like, I feel like, okay, you've got your purpose, your children, and then you're doing your writing. But I don't have kids. So I didn't have all that type of work to do. I just had the writing. And, there was never like, oh, will this pay some point? So at some point I just sat down with myself and I'm like, I need to do something where I know I can get paid. So I was like, I know what I'll do. I'll use my natural ability to listen to people and kind of, connect things up in a psychological way and become a therapist. I'm like 43 at this point. Like, yeah, I'll do that. And when I told RK about it, it was really funny. He was like, yeah, that's good. That's a profession you can do until like you're 80. Even if you're like blind, as long as you can hear, you can like make a buck. That was so funny. That's how he saw it. And I was like, what? But he was very supportive because I think he had always observed over the course of our married life that skill that I had that I was naturally using all the time with people in my life. Sometimes for good, sometimes not so good for me. So I ended up pursuing becoming a therapist. I thought it'd be like 2 years. I'd be out and then I'd be seeing my patients and writing these screenplays. Well, my God, that becoming a therapist, a professional therapist, even at the master's level, took me 7 years. From application going in was like the fall of my 43rd year to getting my full license where I no longer have to be supervised with hours. It was, that happened right before my 50th birthday. So it was like a 7-year journey to becoming a therapist. So these days, I've been practicing now for almost fully licensed, almost 4 years, almost 5 years. Anyway, from 2019, I started practicing, but fully licensed, I started practicing in 2021. So it's probably about 4 years coming up. So I'm young in the profession, but, older, right? So now I do this whole, therapy thing every day with my patients. I practice. And then lo and behold, I've gotten into the act of producing my stand-up comedian husband. I hate comedy, but in service to him, I've reluctantly pursued being a producer for him. I can talk more about that if you want to know more, Habs, next time I check in here. But that has been the surprise of my life. But it does sort of bring in the event planning business I had, even though it's producing a show. It is very people orientated, which like therapy is around people orientation. So now I find myself, doing my therapy and not writing screenplays, but producing comedy shows. But the whole thing, my whole point on crafting a career is how organic and unplanned it all was, and how much I really relish that as I look back on it all.
Well, Muffy, I really enjoyed listening to the journey of your career. I had forgotten some of it. I mean, I knew parts of it. I knew all of it, I think. It's just some of the more details. Yeah, it's funny. We're like two peas in a pod, right? I wasn't an English major, but I was a political science major and an international relations minor. It is kind of funny how you go to school for one thing, but then you end up doing all these other things. I mean, not everybody. There are some people that, okay, I'm going to be a doctor and they become a doctor. I'm going to be an engineer and they become an engineer. And their path is just like very straightforward. And it never veers, right? Now, my husband, while he didn't go to school for IT, I mean, he did get I think a minor or maybe a major in computer science and a minor in economics. He ended up in IT, but his career has been kind of pretty steady and straightforward. It hasn't really veered off too much. I mean, he spent 14 years in pharma, and then he left the corporate field to go into the nonprofit, the educational field, and ended up working at Stanford, but doing IT, and then now at Princeton University doing IT, and he's been there for over 10 years. So there are people that do kind of like, okay, I'm going to school, and then their path is kind of pretty straightforward. And maybe the first job out isn't the job like that's related to their degree, but it's something that they kind of keep on course with. You and I are not those people. And I love the fact of how your career kind of evolved organically. I kind of think the same of mine. And I loved hearing just about all the different things like the screenwriting. And I didn't realize until more recently that you didn't start your career as a therapist until you were 43. And yeah, my gosh, 7 years is a long time. It takes a lot of work, I think, to become a good therapist, which you are. I know that because you give me unpaid for therapy advice, like therapeutic advice. I mean, not like you put on your analytical mind sometimes and it's helpful, but I can see how you're very good with your patients. I realized you worked at the law firm, but I forget, what did you do for the law firm? And I know that you worked for a nonprofit for a while. And then, yeah, your Peppers and Pollywogs party planning business. And, I think it was insightful and encouraging to hear your process with that party planning business, and then how you took a break and things kind of veered away for a while into other directions and how you've ended up. But in many respects, I think, some of the things that you did when you were younger and that you studied have evolved into your current life, namely like your writing. I know you have a lot of writing projects. You've always liked writing. You're very good at it. So it's interesting how little threads, of things kind of stick with you even as your career has organically grown. I knew from a pretty young age that I wanted to major in political science, that I wanted to go into politics, mostly because of my dad. As a hobby, he was really involved in local politics. And I also really, I fantasized like just other countries and other worlds. And so I was really always interested in politics from an international standpoint. And I don't really know where that came from. I mean, I know my mom traveled as like a young woman, like post college with a girlfriend, and they went to all these different countries in Europe. And like that was a time when like young women didn't do that. And she had actually gotten engaged to my dad. And she's like, yep, okay, I'm going to Europe now. I'll see you when I get back. I mean, so, maybe there was a little influence there. And then I did take German in middle school and high school. And I really loved the Germanic language. I don't know. There was something, I think I did some kind of service projects through our church, helping people. And so, yeah, I don't know exactly where that came from. Just, I think my parents were, avid readers and listened to the news and talked about other countries. And so there was some part of me that was really interested in kind of foreign relations. So I graduated from college with a political science major, international relations minor, and I headed also off to DC. I actually also interned on Capitol Hill for this Minnesota senator. I think his name was Dave Durenberg. I think later he had to quit because he had gotten into a little bit of a fishy business, like I don't know, he received like a gift of a condo somewhere or something like that. I don't quote me here, but I know that he kind of was like, oops, I think I'm done working on Capitol Hill because I might get in trouble. So he quietly left. But, yeah, I didn't get paid either. And it was a fun 6 months on Capitol Hill. And then I worked for a senatorial committee. I won't say which one. And that was just a whole nother beast and an interesting ride. Another 6 months or so. And then I ended up at the Overseas Cooperative Development Council, working for my dear mentor, Ted Y. And I lobbied for foreign aid. So in some ways, I did start out my career with kind of like what I was hoping to do. And I really enjoyed that job. We helped nonprofits who create cooperatives overseas in underdeveloped countries, in various ways. But it really got me into learning about the cooperative system. And I even got to travel to some really unique, interesting places. I went to El Salvador. I went to Nicaragua. I went to Guatemala a couple of times. And, it was a great job because my mentor, Ted, he just taught me all those things that you don't learn in college, just how to business write, how to write a business letter, just all those basic skills they don't really focus on when you go to school. So, and then I was dating my husband A, and I decided it was time to make a change. And I left DC and I moved back to New Jersey. And I got into the healthcare arena. I was on the consulting side for a few years, but then I really wanted to work for big pharma. Pharma in New Jersey was huge. I think it's still pretty huge. It's definitely a hub, although there are other places like San Francisco that are now also a pharma hub in LA. And so I ended up working at J&J. And I took a random role. It was like a business administrative role. And that was very interesting. My key criteria for doing that was one, I wanted to see what the corporate world was all about. I'd worked in the nonprofit world for 5 years. I wanted to get more business experience. I also wanted to get my master's. So I went back and got my master's in communications. And then things, A and I decided we wanted a change of scenery. We traveled a lot. We always traveled out west and we really liked it. So I ended up getting a job through J&J in Silicon Valley. And so then A and I moved there. I did that for a little bit. Unfortunately, the company did not survive. And so J&J shut it down. I went back to the healthcare consulting world for a little bit. I did this fun thing called competitive intelligence. Essentially, it was like going to major health conferences and gathering data and information from competitors. So it really was a little bit like being a spy. I mean, I felt that because sometimes like some of the conferences, they weren't really too keen about that activity. And so they would parole and you could get in trouble if you got caught. Other conferences were a little bit looser. So it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Then I ended up in academia with my husband. And I worked in a really cool area where I worked with postdocs and medical students and graduate students, a lot of professional development, very passionate about professional development. It's kind of been a common theme throughout my career, as well as just like planning programs and events and gatherings. And so, A and I decided that we wanted to figure out where we could live and buy a home. And we felt like Silicon Valley was not going to be that place. It's just too out of our price range, which is funny in terms of where we are now. And we ended up moving back to the East Coast and back to New Jersey, central New Jersey, which I really didn't know a lot about. And he and I both ended up in academia again. I spent about 7 years at Princeton, and then I just felt like I wasn't being challenged. I wasn't excited. And so I tried a couple of different fields, one in nonprofits, one in kind of like an arts nonprofit, the other in an academic, and more on the development side, doing like special events. And some of that I liked. I mean, I don't love fundraising per se. I like developing events for fundraising, but the fundraising part of it is not necessarily my stig. Is that a word? My steez? I don't know. So I am currently throughout all of these different career twists and turns, like I said, I really enjoy kind of putting on events. So I don't know if I'm a party planner, but in essence, a little bit. But I really, I've done a lot of volunteer work where I live, and I put on a lot of events and community gatherings and community fundraising efforts. And I just really enjoy putting together a good event that makes people happy and that has, like happy endings. I mean, usually my events have. They've been very successful. And so now I've been dilly-dallying with this for a while about starting my own event planning business. So that is what I am currently working on. And a mother of a middle school and high school schooler. So like life is busy. And so, yeah, my career has also taken kind of this organic path. I mean, I often, when I do interview, I've touched so many different fields, so many different genres, I've met and worked with so many different types of people, from plasma physicists to drug development, a scientist to lobbyists to, I even worked with people in the White House. I didn't work in the White House, but, or presidents of like big nonprofit organizations. So like, I'm just, from that standpoint, I feel like I've touched, like I know enough about a lot of things, I guess is what I'm saying. But I think my true kind of passion that has emerged is not something that I knew that I really had, is more around, setting up and executing events. So when I think about T going off to college, I find it very difficult to give advice because, I mean, who knows, right? Where anybody's career is going to go. Some people become stay-at-home moms or dads. I mean, I am currently kind of a stay-at-home mom, but ultimately I've done stints of staying at home and not working, and I really do enjoy working. So I know that I will always be working. But, you just don't know where your career's going to go or what's going to happen. I mean, you may, like me, I mean, I started my career in political science. Like, I don't really like politics anymore, like at all. It's funny, right? Like, it's just like, you don't know where and how you're going to end up. So I guess that's the magic of life and experience. It's a little scary and terrifying at times, but it also, like, going through this, it just means that, like, we're living life, and we're open to whatever comes our way. So, I mean, I guess that's the advice that I would give my daughter T. Like, you know, you may expect to go one way and you may end up in a very different place. It's tough to know, but just enjoy the ride.
Hi, Habs. It's Muffy. I loved hearing about your career progression. I mean, I also knew some of it or a lot of it between DC and California and New Jersey. But wow, you have indeed worked with so many different types of people. And I think it has set you up for the business you're pursuing right now, which is event planning. Because in event planning, you have to meet every type of person, and they're all different, coming from different walks of life and industry backgrounds. And I think with all of your experience over the many years across all these industries, I think you can meet people where they are, who they are, and give them the event that they want to have. And I know you're also capable of all different types of events. So I think you're right. As we have a progression of career in our lives, we can find our skills and strengths and amalgamate them into a professional path that really suits us, that really is on point with who we are, where we've been, and our strengths as far as what we can do, and also our passion, because we've done all sorts of things that we had passion for and it ran out, or we never had passion for, or it's a discernment process that took place over decades. And I think the 50s is a time when people can really, really come into their own professionally, particularly if you're launching something of your own. And I think in these days, oh, all the days actually, but in these days, the pivot, being able to pivot is so very, very important. I'm talking about this a lot with my patients. Just the idea of like, if plan A isn't really working out for you professionally, looking at what is that attachment to and what makes it difficult to kind of let go and pivot to something else that may be waiting in the wings for you. And of course, that pivoting is always a process, but being encouraged to pivot, to open yourself up to other new possibilities, especially when doors aren't opening in a certain way, I think is really important throughout one's career, and life in general, but particularly in career. I also was thinking about, yeah, how you and I both got liberal arts background degrees and kind of went out there and started to make our way and organically moved here and there and took up skills, and that there is another way to go through life, which you said, if you're going to be a doctor, if you're going to be an engineer, you're going to go do that. And then you're going to, do that the rest of your life. And you kind of know early. And RK really epitomizes that because he did not grow up in America. He grew up in Malaysia till the age of, I think, 13. And then he went to boarding school in Australia. And because of the political scene in Malaysia, people who are not Muslim do not necessarily get the same opportunities. And there are a lot of Indian people like RK and Chinese people, so they don't have as many opportunities professionally. So it was always established that you're going to Australia, hopefully to go through college and work in Australia. But in case you are coming back to Malaysia, because, who knew what would happen with his immigration status, in Australia back in the 80s, his father said to him, like, I think when he was in high school, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant. Pick one. Because if you are a professional and come back to Malaysia, then, even though you're not a Muslim and won't get a government job or other jobs that are favoring the Muslims, you can establish your own thing and work and make a living. So, he was given these free choices because of the political times and the countries he was in. And in Australia at that time, I think it's a little bit less like this these days. But if you were going to go to medical school, in America, you have your undergraduate years to decide and like what go pre-med and then take your MCATs and then post graduation from your school, go on to medical school. Back then, it wasn't like that in Australia. You had to declare at 18, I'm going to medical school, and also try for a position in the medical school. So then if you got in, it was a 6-year program. So it's kind of fast track compared to America. And you basically are going to be on a track to be a doctor from the age of 18. So there's very, very little give on, oh, I might try something else. A lot of people, actually, it's funny, I'm thinking about Wittenberg right now. Um, like those intro biology classes or intro chem classes, the freshman year, fall term, are like filled with hundreds of kids. They're like, I'm going pre-med, I'm going pre-med. And then by the end of those classes, everyone is weeded out, and there's just a few people who are actually going to be pre-med. And then they still have 4 years to decide if they're actually going to do it, and then take the MCATs during that time and all of it. I mean, it's just a lot more delayed process. So RK not only had to decide on one of those professions, which he did, he had to declare it at the age of 18. And so within medicine, he chose to become a subspecialized radiologist. So his father didn't say like what type of doctor or how much training he should get or anything like that, but just pick something professional. And so he kind of went all the way with radiology and being more innovative than most doctors, because most doctors will get their degree, join a private practice, and like that's where they're going to stay, right, their whole lives. And because it's such a tech field, radiology, he's been able to move countries and continents and get licensed across different places in the world. He also has been able to subspecialize in lots of different areas. So he's taken that as far as he can, as far as opportunity within the medical field to like get as broad a range and as most opportunity as he can. And luckily in choosing radiology, he was able to get that. But of course, RK was very, very talented with writing and English. He has a turn of words talent. Speaking of which, when I had the kids' party planning company, I had a little section on my website called Request a Rhyme, and a poet would write a poem for the kids' party invitation. And RK was one of my Request a Rhyme poets. I had like 5, and they all had a sample, and then parents could come on and read the samples and then choose their poet. And I think for like 10 or $15, they got a personalized poem of 8 lines with like the venue and the time, what the kid's turning and the theme. And so he used to do that for me. It was so great. So he has that capacity. And, much later in life, right? He is now pursuing stand-up comedy. So not only does he like to write comedically, but he likes to get up on a stage and perform, which is exactly the opposite of sitting in a dark room reading x-rays of people's insides. So there's 2 very distinct parts of him. I think there are distinct parts of all of us that want to come out and play professionally in different areas. And I'm so glad that, even though he's in his mid-50s and we think of like comedians as like a young person's game, that, he's just doing it. He's going out there and doing it. And I think, that also had me taking an acting class for over the course of a year and like learning about acting to learn about the creative mind. Of course, I'm not an actress and I would not want to do that, but it just got me engaged in a whole different field of performance and meeting really young people. And I know he meets lots of young people. And given we don't have children, it's wonderful to have young adults in our life in this way. So it's just a really different thing, but it doesn't just give us another professional outlet, but also, you know, um, meeting people who are much different to us, and yet we have something in common. And so I think that's also very cool about professions and coming into something really new when you're really middle-aged and people much younger than you have been doing it much longer than you. So you're really young. That's how I feel in my therapy career too, right? I'm like 5 years in from graduation. But most people my age are like 25 years in or 30 years in. So comparatively, there's a lot much younger therapists who have a lot more, years under their belt than me. But, you keep doing the same thing again and again and again, and it gets kind of boring after a while. So I'm really glad I did take it up midlife, and he's doing the comedy and then he needs help with producing a show, and that all that event planning experience for me with the kids' parties is being put to use in that way, which is back to kind of the entrepreneurial world. So it is interesting how things do come full circle.
Muffy, it is really interesting, kind of the debate between getting a liberal arts education and getting a more specific trade education. And I say debate because I know my sister and brother-in-law feel very strongly that you should go to school to obtain a certain skill versus like going for English or poetry or archaeology or I don't know, art history, like that they're a little bit more obscure and it kind of leaves one thinking like, well, where are they going to go with this unless maybe they go on for some type of advanced degree or if you're a writer or journalism, like something very, very specific. I don't know that I agree with that. I don't disagree. I think that both choices are good. It just really depends on the person. And you're right. I do remember, the people that were thinking, oh, med school or veterinarian school or something like that. I mean, they did get weeded out pretty quickly in the first year biology and chemistry classes. I'm glad I didn't go that route, to be quite frank. However, I do understand why RK was encouraged to go a very specific route with a very specific profession based on where he grew up and what that was going to mean for him. So, yeah, I think the circumstances are really different for everybody. And so, to have like a very strong opinion in one direction, it doesn't always work for everyone. I know that T has a friend who wants to be a teacher, but her mom wants her to be an engineer. So, like, really, how is that going to end up for her? I don't know. And, just because you think, oh, I want to be a teacher, maybe you go down that path and then you're like, yeah, I don't want to be a teacher. I know I certainly did with, politics. I'm interested in politics, but, I did my stint in DC and that was enough. And I guess I have to say, I much prefer federal politics to local politics. I mean, my gosh, when I moved from DC to New Jersey and I experienced local politics, the people there were nasty. There are nasty people in DC, don't get me wrong, at the federal level, obviously. Well, at least in my opinion. But there's a sense of like camaraderie between the main two political parties. I know I had a larger group of friends and there were both Republicans and Democrats, and we could hang out and we could argue amicably, and that was that. But man, when I came to New Jersey and just did one or two things, I remember being with these like older women, and my God, they really hated the other side. I mean, hate is a light word when it comes to, and these are like, respectable, like polite women. Wow, yeah. So I was done with that after that experience. But I'm glad that things worked out for RK, and I think that he's found a nice blend of both being an amazing doctor, radiologist, and then also incorporating some of his writing and communication skills into his life in a way that he really gives him a lot of pleasure. I do remember, and A does too, when we went to your wedding celebration, we remember RK giving the most amazing speech. I mean, it was so eloquent. I don't remember everything he said, but I remember like even A walking away being like, wow, man, I wish I could like give a speech like that. So he is very much what is the word for somebody who speaks? I don't know. I can't think of it at the moment, but yeah. So yes, you took acting classes, and I think that's great because you did meet a lot of young people and young friends and interesting people, and it brings out different possibilities, regardless of whether or not you were wanting to go into acting or not. I think it just kind of brought you into that world and understanding like what it's all about and meeting some really cool and interesting people. Yes, I agree. I think with our experience now and years of experience, we are able to pivot a little bit easier. And I do think that's a really important skill that not everybody has. I know my husband does not. It was very hard for him to go from being in pharma as an IT person to trying a different field. That was a very scary prospect. He did it and he doesn't regret it, but it took a lot of courage to do that for him. Now, I have pivoted fairly easily. I will say pivoting to planning and owning my own event planning business is a lot scarier. And I sometimes just think, oh my gosh, I have to have a safety net. I'm not going to be successful. I mean, definitely that imposter syndrome and like, can I really do this? I mean, I know you've said many times to me that yes, you absolutely can do this. You're good at it. You're ready. Go for it. But it's still really scary to jump, right? And take that risk because it's like, okay, I feel like I know it can be real and successful, but really, will it be? I mean, yeah, it's scary not having the safety net. But I think where I've gone and where I've landed to in my career, that I am a little bit more open to really trying something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. I always admire you and your capability to do that, to just jump in and be entrepreneurial and try something. Sink or swim, right? So I definitely look up to you when it comes to trying one of the most scariest things for me, but also exciting, right? So it's a weird time in my life. And so I think, reflecting back on my career and time, you just never know where you're going to end up. And, I think that's why it's hard to say for sure, oh, yes, you're going to go be this, you're going to go be that, go do that, because that may not end up being true. So I think being really open to many different choices and then kind of following your instincts from there is really the best way to go, especially if you don't know what you want to be when you grow up. And I say that in quotation marks because most people don't. And most people still say that, A and I talk to a lot of the young people, like T and her cousin M, and we're like, yeah, we still don't know what we want to be when we grow up. So I don't like that question. Um, because I don't know that one can truly ever answer it. We're always searching. Even when somebody really knows that, like, they want to be a doctor and they spend their whole life being a doctor, I think a lot of those people also have other hobbies and their hobbies, right? I don't think my husband A ever would have thought, like, oh, I'm going to be this IT guy. I mean, he had no clue what he wanted to do. He first just followed in his dad's footsteps, who got a PhD in chemistry, and he figured out early on in college that that definitely was not the path for him. But he has a lot of the same skill sets as his father. I mean, I certainly life is a mystery because, I mean, I was a determined little girl to be in politics. And look where I am now. I have always that little political spark in me, whether it's like local community engagement and that type of thing. But yeah, I never would have dreamed that I am where I am today. It's not a bad thing. And it's okay. As much as I want T to learn from my experience, my mistakes, my successes, at the same time, she's going to have her own journey, regardless. And it's easy to say, looking back, like, gosh, I wish I'd known this or that. But like, that is part of like life. And one's career is learning along the way, learning from mistakes, figuring out what you like and dislike. And that's really that the best that you can do. So I think it's really interesting. You said something about things coming full circle. And I think it's true. Like you start out in your career, trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up. And you continue and you end with that. So things do come full circle, Muffy. Thanks for listening to Girls Who Gab with Habs and Muffy, as we shared our career stories, where we started, where our journeys took us, and where we have landed today. For more, follow us on Instagram at Girls Who Gab with Habs and Muffy. Until next time, when we talk about April Fool's Day, let's have a little fun. Cheers!